times that we have met after the pandemic. So very nice to see so many faces here and responding to our invite to come and join us for this talk. So thanks to everyone for coming to participate here. And I will request Professor Meernik Sharma to introduce our department to everyone gathered here today. Good afternoon.
A very warm welcome to Professor Kimi and James Meernik. It's a privilege to host both of you here, and it's really kind of you that you sort of, decided, or we could actually come in contact and we could have this sort of a meeting, which is beneficial, I think, in both the ways. Like for us, for our students, as you can see, this large group of students, we have almost 130 regular PhD scholars, and besides that, we have part-timers and self-sponsored students, so we almost go up to 150, 160 just now. And for the last 2 years, they all have been away. We have all been doing everything online. But it's, like only now, like in the last few months, that sort of people have started coming in. And now we are filling up. And we are having physical classes, and social distancing norms are being relaxed. So after all, this whatever happened to each of us, as Professor Martha said, that the first few more, occasions when we have met, and it's really wonderful that it's talking about working and in an area which sort of makes very pertinent this type of understandings to talk about endangered language communities, because according to the UNESCO list, we sort of are very high in this list. I need to say number of languages from an area, which does not only is a matter for linguists or language experts, but I think is also a very serious concern for people living here. It's a social concern, it's a cultural matter which needs understanding, deeper understanding, and this type of interventions in these areas really for our students to get exposed to know the type of work that's going across the world is very beneficial. So as you say, we hope to keep this on. We are 11 disciplines of humanities and social sciences in this under this umbrella called HSS Humanities. We are in an engineering school. There are challenges that we have every day, but at the same time, it is very important for us that we just academically, the type of challenges that we have, we meet them, and this type of changes, dear students, faculty members who are here, is we should always encourage. We should always be sort of connected to researchers, academicians across the world who are working in these areas, which, as I said and I'm repeating, are very pertinent and relevant to the area, to the country in which we are in. So, thanks so much for spending your time here with us, and it will be a pleasure to host you again. So it's not just, it should not be that, it should be the last time, please do come again, and we will keep in touch. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. So before we start, I again welcome Professors Kimi and Professor James Meernik. Brief introduction. I think I will not be able to cover everything that both the professors have been doing. Just a brief introduction based on what I could gather from the writer. So, Professor Kimi King, she's engaged in political science from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and she also has JD from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and she works a lot on conflict resolution, and a lot of her work reflects her very important work with criminal tribunals for in former Yugoslavia and also Yugoslavia and other regions there, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, and Albanian, and also reconciliation issues and complications. So with or doubt, truth and justice, witness self-perceptions about the contributions to the ICT life, with Professor Meernik in Legacies of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. A multidisciplinary account is forthcoming and to be published by OUP, and another work, The Witness Experience Testimony at the ICT Life and its Impact, from CUT, Cambridge University Press, and a lot of other publications in those areas. So, and then also briefly introducing Professor James Meernik, who was the Regents professor from 2017, University of North Texas. Regents professor is UNT's highest designation for faculty, and he is also the director of the Castleberry Peace Institute from 2014, and he has many laurels, and he has been he has won the Faculty Leadership Award in 2015. 2015 he received the President's Council Service Award, top award for contributions to university service, and with 2012 also the Citation for Distinguished Service to International Education. So, and I can go on, but he's a very distinguished professor from UNT, as you can imagine. So, and his distinguished publications are, again, As War Ends, What Colombia Tells Us About Sustainability of Peace and Transitional Justice from the Cambridge University Press, and also Judging Justice, How Victim Witnesses Evaluate International Courts, University of Michigan Press, and also the Witness Experience with Professor Kimi King, Cambridge University Press. Judgment Day, co-authored with Rosa Alosi from Cambridge University Press. So I will not go on. So, and these are some of the representative publications that give you an idea about their work, and they are talking about language endangerment, and we are very much looking forward to this kind of interdisciplinary work, where specialists from political science are looking at the challenges that we have with regard to language endangerment, and it's very important that these we have these perspectives from different disciplines, and not as linguists alone, but specialists who can offer perspectives and of course resolutions for the challenges that we face in these areas. And without further ado, I would request Professor Kimi and Professor James Meernik to begin their lecture, and we're really looking forward to a very interesting and engaging talk. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone.
Thank you very much. Very kind introduction. I do want to say welcome to all of you for being here. It is also very exciting for us to be here, that this is your first week really back being in school. So thank you for sharing that and bringing, all your interest in this very important area to us. We do see this as the beginning of a very productive conversation between not only your university and our university, but more importantly between linguists and political scientists, because they have so much more in common, and usually that is the case. We have so much more in common that unite us than divide us. And that's part of the reason why we have the interest that we do in language endangerment and in the conflicts involving political violence that can contribute to that language loss. Linguists are so important for helping to document that. And that's one of the reasons why we feel it's so important to continue a partnership with you. So today what we're going to be looking at is one specific area of Colombia, but thinking about the possibilities and whatever it is that you are studying out there, I would invite all of you to think about the opportunities or things that you see, that you hear resonate with the research that you do. And think about ways in which you might be interested in incorporating some of that into your research. And so I'm going to turn a little bit over here so that I can look at the screen. I hope that's okay. I'm not going to mess you up over there. So the idea where this research really came from was actually a conference, and we're speaking with your faculty about the possibility of perhaps doing a student conference where you could present some of your work as well. But it came from a conference trying to look at these commonalities. And so the goal here is to try to synthesize some of the similarities and contributions that we hear from both linguists and political scientists about the study of language endangerment as well as conflict violence, which sadly in too many parts of the world really run together. And perhaps it's not just Northeast India, you may be studying places all over the world in which this may be applicable. And what we're behavioralists and political scientists are sort of overly obsessed with numbers. So when you talked about engineering, we feel that that's a perfect complement to this kind of work, because what we wanted to do was develop kind of a statistical model to help explain language loss and some of the factors that go along with it. And then part of why we wanted to come visit here is you want to try to identify the next steps for what you need to do for your field work. And then I think very importantly, one thing that both the linguists and the political scientists at the conference were aware of is that there are important ethical guideposts that we should be thinking about as you look at getting data from communities or as you study communities, that these are a people that have endured political violence, a loss of culture and of heritage, and to be thinking about the larger community. So this research here focuses on key factors that political scientists would be a little bit more focused on, but trying to incorporate some of those linguistic concerns. What leads to language loss? What are the underlying conditions? What are similarities? What are differences as you look across different geographic areas? So this is really just inductive and exploratory. It really feels to us like we're just taking little baby steps at learning and thinking about this to try to build a subnational model of language endangerment and survival within individual countries, which is what we're doing with Colombia here today, but to try to expand it to look at whether there's a generalizable model. And so we've chosen variables selected on prior research from linguists about language loss and political scientists who look at violent conflict in an area. And what we're really trying to do is look at those risk factors. When are communities most at risk? What are the factors that contribute to that kind of language loss? And then recognize the importance of the community where the language loss is occurring. Again, that's part of that ethical guidepost that when you go into a community, you want to better understand it, not just to study it. Okay, so what do we look at? We are using political science data of endangered languages in Colombia. And if you look at Colombia, it has a great deal of both language loss and political violence over the course of a 52-year war that has been carried out. And so we're trying to identify political, economic, and social risk factors that contribute to that. We use data from the Colombian government. One of the things that's fascinating about India is that there's a lot of data out there for being able to study these kinds of things. And we want to also identify political violence, economic and social indicators that are again coming from Colombian government sources, and then focus on those key factors, as I mentioned, that relate to political violence, and see if there are differences between different levels of communities that may be facing language loss. And so if we look at the endangered languages, this is from Colombia. We just want to kind of give you a feel for the richness of it. We are looking at about 60 different endangered languages of Colombia, finding data on some of them. Some of the languages are so endangered that getting data on them is just simply impossible because they are disappearing, sadly. And what you see is that it occurs in a relatively small percentage of the municipalities that we are studying here. And so we use one particular area of the people of Kamsa and Inga communities in Sibundoy. Those are just who we're representing graphically. We are looking across all of Colombia, those 60 different languages. So in terms of the types of endangered languages in Colombia, among those 60, what we're looking at is this idea of folks that are in, people that are in vulnerable, critical situation, I should move it this way, in danger, vulnerable, critical situation, and then in danger of distinction. And so it's interesting to look at that kind of range of endangered language loss and starting to try to make distinctions about that as well. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Meernik, who's going to walk through the different kind of indicators involved with language endangerment as part of both a preliminary overview as well as a statistical analysis.
All right, let me see if I can almost do this from the podium to see everything. So again, thank you all for hosting us here today. We are so very pleased and proud to be here and sharing some of this research with you. And as Dr. King expressed, we hope that this is the beginning of a very collaborative relationship on research and also teaching and learning. Now, the project that Dr. King has just kind of set out for you is this project in which we are trying to understand what are the risk factors that are leading to language loss across Colombia. And Colombia is a very interesting country to study for many reasons, one of which is that there is this huge variation in many different kinds of indicators across Colombia. It's a very diverse nation in terms of geography, in terms of social conditions, economic conditions, in terms of where the violence of the Civil War that lasted from 1964 to 2016 took place. And so what we set out to do with this project was to try to discover, are there particular factors that are associated with those communities in which we find that there is a great deal of language loss. All we're really doing with this kind of statistical testing is looking at correlations. We can't really speak in terms of one factor causing another because many of our concepts that you'll see that I'll be talking about in just a minute are measured at different points of time. Much of the data on language loss is measured at different points in time because not all of the many different endangered language communities in Colombia are contacted on a regular basis to determine just how many speakers are left. And so what we hope to do then is to identify these risk factors that are associated with communities where language loss is most prevalent and develop a better understanding of why language loss occurs. As one of the initial slides illustrated though, this is only a first step. We developed these statistical models to kind of get a broad picture, a kind of a macro level picture of language loss and conflict violence and how those two factors relate together. But then ultimately, to truly understand what factors cause language loss, that really means that we as scholars have to go into the field and work with these communities to understand the kinds of challenges that they face and to also help document their language loss. So this is part of a kind of a long-term project in which we're working with different partners in linguistics and also experts in Colombia as well. So what I'm going to do first is take you through some basic kind of figures and graphs to kind of help illustrate these relationships. Before I kind of jump right into that though, I should mention that there was the Civil War in Colombia that lasted between 1964 roughly and 2016, when the Colombian government signed this very comprehensive peace agreement with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as the FARC. And that ended the Civil War. There's still violence today in Colombia, unfortunately, coming from many different causes. Sometimes it's political violence, oftentimes it's criminal violence associated with the cocaine trade and the drug cartels. But there was violence during the Civil War that was a result of fighting between the leftist FARC group and the government. Sometimes the leftist FARC group was also battling the rightist paramilitary groups. Sometimes the rightist paramilitary groups were battling the drug cartels, and sometimes all four groups were fighting each other. So there was just a lot of different kinds of violence. And often in Colombia, we find that much of the violence was, whether it was political or economic or something else in nature, it tended to involve these different groups trying to acquire and hold land. And often, as we'll point out here, it was land, the land in which we find many of these endangered language communities. So what we see here is a measure, we took a measure of conflict violence, which is simply just a count of the number of conflict violence incidents in all of Colombia's 1,100 plus municipalities. So virtually every municipality across Colombia was affected by the conflict in some way, but some communities, some municipalities were affected much more so than others. And so what our data shows here is just this, this level of conflict violence, but we also try to normalize it so that we can compare across different communities. So it's conflict violence per 100,000 inhabitants. And so you can see here that 60%, what this number right here shows us is that 60% of the language endangered communities are located where the most political violence was occurring. So in other words, these communities are not only experiencing issues and problems because of loss of language and heritage and culture, but they are in the very lands, the very parts of Colombia that have been fought over the most. And we can talk a little bit later on about, you know, why the violence is taking place there. It takes place there for many reasons, but that obviously creates a very significant risk factor for these communities, because oftentimes what happens is that the conflict violence affects them directly. Many people will be killed, children will be recruited to join some of the armed forces, and people will be displaced. People will be thrown out of their homes, entire villages will be burned down in order for these armed groups to acquire the land, to either hold this territory for political purposes, or to use this territory for some part of the drug trade, whether it's the growing of coca, or processing, or transportation. But these language communities exist in some very dangerous conditions. You see there that when we look at the medium levels of conflict violence, that the endangered language communities are not so well represented there. Neither are they, there's only 25% of them are represented where there are low levels of political violence. And those are often places that are either very remote or often very urban, where there was less of the political battles taking place. And so you see those language communities being much more prevalent here in these kinds of areas than in the others. Here as well we see where these armed actors are present. And this is one of the most critical factors that help us understand political violence in Colombia, is the extent to which these lands are being fought over. The more armed groups in these areas, the more that signifies that this land is valuable, and usually as well that no one group can seem to hold on to it. It may be because of difficult conditions there, or it may be because the land is so valuable, either for military purposes or for the drug cartels, that there are constant battles to acquire it because it is so valuable. But you can see there that in those areas where there's no active groups, and again, very remote areas where hardly anyone lives, or urban areas where the armed groups aren't as involved in actual actual direct fighting in the big cities, like say Bogota or Cali. The endangered language communities, 57% of them are there, and so that's most of them. So that is the good news. But then you see here, as we kind of move down, where there are 2 or more groups, 13% of the endangered language groups are there. 11% exist in these areas where 3 groups are active. So that's could be the FARC on the left, the government military is there, and the rightist paramilitary forces. So imagine living in a town where you've got a 3-sided war. Or even worse here, where you not only have the drug cartels, the government, you have the rightist political forces, and the leftist FARC groups all battling it out. So you've got 4 groups, all trying to kill each other, all trying to take over the land, all very suspicious of the communities that are there, because they're often, these armed groups are always trying to figure out, okay, who's on our side, who is helping us, and who, who are the people who are aiding the other groups? Who are the people in these communities who are providing information or intelligence to these groups? And so all the armed groups come into these communities very suspicious of these people because they don't know who's who and who's on what side. And unfortunately, often what happens when these groups come into these communities, if they don't know people's loyalty, the easiest thing to do is to not care and just kill everyone, or kill a certain number of people as assigned others that, if you do cooperate with anyone else, your lives will be threatened. And so, although only 3% of these endangered language communities are found in these most volatile, these most violent of municipalities, those are a very small number to begin with. So these are the most dangerous places of all, and those endangered language communities are unfortunately often present there. This gives us a little bit of data on who are the victims of this violence that I was just talking about. And so you can see there that the indigenous groups are represented in the darker bar here, and the Afro-Colombian population is illustrated in this kind of orange-colored bar. And I should point out that these are absolute numbers. And in absolute numbers, the Afro-Colombian population in Colombia is much, much larger than the indigenous groups. But they are also a very marginalized group that often is sort of pushed to the edges of Colombian territory. As soon as a group, whether it's the government or one of the political guerrilla groups fighting, as soon as they decide that they want a piece of land, they push these groups away out of there, and then they're sent somewhere else. And then maybe later on, some other groups come in and says, oh, we want that area. So now they push these groups, whether Afro-Colombian or the indigenous groups, to an even more marginal existence. So they keep getting pushed further and further out, having to restart their lives. Or often what happens too is that many of them are driven into the cities to try to earn a living there, or to beg on the streets. But there's obviously been a great deal of violence. You can see that even though the war ended in 2016, violence continues to this day. There's still a fair amount of violence in Colombia that targets both of these groups. Again, often because they're in these areas that are very valuable for one reason or another, and to this day the groups continue to fight over them. So even though, for example, the leftist FARC group demobilized and their troops all went home, or they went back to their to live in other areas, that means that they leave these regions that they were the powers in. They leave the places where they ran the government, and now suddenly it's the area's open for other groups to come into and to compete to see if they can now become the dominant power. And so unfortunately, that's one of the consequences of these peace agreements, that when one group demobilizes and leaves, some other group comes in to try to take over. But often one group is not allowed to simply come in and take over. Some other group will fight with them. So there's this constant violence, and there's also a targeting, especially of many of the indigenous activists in Colombia who are trying to stand up for their own rights, try to protect their lands, to try to keep them from being occupied by the drug cartels, by the multinational corporations that want to come in and set up African palm plantations or mining operations. And so members of indigenous groups who protest against that are often killed too. So that's why you still see this political violence to this day occurring.
This is another way of kind of looking at violence, homicides, which ordinary murders. So these are data from the police. We don't always know why people were killed. We just know that they were murdered. And again, you can see that the endangered language communities here, 47% of them exist in the places where there are the most murders, the most homicides in Colombia. The non-endangered language communities, occupy a much different kind of position in society. People there live in relative safety compared to the challenges that the people in the endangered languages communities face. And then here's something more about coca production. So you can see there that actually the interesting thing here is that where there's the non-endangered language communities, once again, most of them are in areas where coca is not being grown. Obviously, most people are living in the cities. That's not where they're growing coca. They're growing coca out in the country. But 40% of the endangered language communities are in these areas where the coca is being grown. Sometimes they take part in this willingly because sometimes that's the only way they can earn money. But they also realize that this is a very dangerous game to play, that even though the money is attractive, that once you kind of sign up with these drug cartels, then you better stick to your agreements with them. Any attempt to get out of the agreement or any attempt to try to bring in the police to try to deal with their violence will be met with severe repercussions. So that's just yet one more indication of the kind of dangers facing these communities. And then lastly, we see too that these endangered language communities, over 2/3 of them are in the poorest parts of Colombia. That almost kind of goes without saying, because these endangered language communities, like I said, are being pushed further and further away from the more productive agricultural land into the more remote areas where it's not only difficult to grow things, it's very difficult to get crops to market, and so forth. So there's a great deal of poverty, a great deal of high levels of infant mortality, not a lot of government support. The government tends not to provide a lot of money to these communities. In fact, the government tends to stay out of them, which is one of the big problems. The government has kind of just sort of left these communities to their own devices. You can imagine here, if the police one day decided to up and leave, then the armed groups would, or criminals, whoever, would say, great, we can come in now and take over. And that's exactly what happens in Colombia. No government, no police. That leaves it up to these armed actors to be the only force that is providing any kind of governance or security, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. So this is kind of the final analysis where we try to bring all these factors together to try to understand these associations between the different factors that I was just going over and the extent to which they associate with the presence of endangered language community. You can see that as inequality goes up, the negative relationship means that the level of language endangerment goes down, in large part because these communities are so marginalized that there is a lot of inequality. Everybody's poor. That's the long and short of that. But then we see that the number of conflict actors, as I was just talking about, the more of those different groups that are involved in a municipality, the more likely it is that it causes language endangerment. We see that the more coca that is grown, the more likely that's associated with language endangerment. And then infant mortality, which is our measure of poverty, as that goes up, the likelihood of that being an endangered language community goes up as well. So the very risk factors I was just talking about, we see here in this larger statistical model are still turning up as statistically significant. So there are many kind of other risk factors that relate to language endangerment. Perhaps we can talk about more of that in the question and answer period. But we hope this kind of gives you a good sort of understanding of what these risk factors are. And so our hope is that ultimately we can kind of take what we've learned from Colombia and begin to see if we can apply these statistical models and our understanding about these risk factors to other countries and other situations. And so, again, our research strategy is to first kind of develop these sort of this general statistical model, looking at these factors in very kind of high-level statistical analysis, determine what the most important factors are, work in the field to better understand from the language communities themselves what are the factors that are causing this. Is the poverty something that they would say is very important to them? Is it the actual level of violence? Is it the homicides? Or is it just the fact that they have all these different armed groups competing for territory? How long has this been going on for them? And what are their challenges with keeping people in the community? Whether because of economic reasons or because young people are being recruited by these armed groups. So there's many things that we still need to learn from this kind of field work and getting to know things at a much more micro level instead of the macro statistical level. And then take all that qualitative and quantitative evidence together to really begin to tell that story, that narrative of how languages are lost in these areas, this dynamic story that kind of helps us understand over time why languages are lost, but also hopefully help us understand what we can do to correct some of these risk factors and to help these endangered language groups survive. And then ultimately too, as Dr. King pointed out, we believe it's really important for us as scholars when we research these communities and spend time with people to not just kind of go in there with the attitude that we want to take from them. We want to take information, we want to take stories, we want to take, their information they can give us about language loss, but we want to, in a way that doesn't interfere with our scientific objectivity or neutrality, but give back to them, to find ways in which we can take our knowledge, whether it's about language loss or about other subjects, and help give back to those communities. So we think that that's a really important part of what we do, that we shouldn't always just come into these communities with the expectation that we're going to be welcomed with open arms to once again take more. We want to give back. And in many ways, we think it's actually perhaps important to begin with that, to begin establishing those relationships about how we can build cooperative ties together at first, and then later on figure out what we can do with research, so that we demonstrate that our goals are to help the community and not come in there like so many others, collect information, and then leave. So with that, we'll close up the presentation and see if we have questions for us. Thank you.
Questions? Please introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Emily. Very, very interesting talk. I just wanted to know more about you at the end you mentioned the give and take aspect of it. So you said that we just don't want to take information, but we want to give. I just want to know more about what are the suggestions that you've come up with the giving part.
Yes, so one of the things that I do through my Castleberry Peace Institute in Colombia is I work with a university there called the Pontifical Boulevard University, the Catholic University, so it's referred to as by its initials PBU. And so our partnership just simply began with discovering if we had some shared research interest, and we did. We worked on that part of the relationship too. But their faculty were also interested in one particular community in Medellin. That's where the university is. And so while this particular example does not apply to the language communities because we have not got to that stage yet where we go into the communities, that's something that's still a little bit further down the road, but we have applied those lessons in other ways. And so for example, there's this community that exists on the outskirts of Medellin called Alta Vista. And like a lot of communities that kind of exist on the edge of cities, they're often neglected. They don't enjoy the same kind of governmental resources or support. They're very far out, so if people do work in the city, they have really long journeys to get to their jobs. And also as a consequence of being out sort of in the periphery of the city, unfortunately this community has been existing along these trails that actually, the trails through this community date back to the times of the Spanish expedition and all the troubles that the Spanish brought into South America. Because this community of Alta Vista sits at the very edge of Medellin, and behind them, there's nothing but jungle. And so when guns and drugs or other contraband come into Medellin to then disperse throughout Colombia, they come down this trail. And so this community has a reputation for being a place where there's lots of violence because these groups coming down there trying to use these trails, trying to set up headquarters in this community. And so one of the things, actually the community's tried to do several things to sort of help prevent that from happening, help protect itself. One of which is to try to promote more community spirit and promote better education for their students. And one of the ways that they're doing this is through creating a community garden in which vegetables and fruits are grown for all the people in the community. The children are taught how to grow these things, and the community kind of takes it on as a project. So my institute has provided the money to set up the garden and to create the necessary supplies for them to run the garden. We're also supporting a tourism project there because the community hopes that if more tourists come in, then that's going to discourage the drug cartels and others to go somewhere else, because the more activity there is, the more people moving around, the less comfortable they are with that. And then we're also working with what's called their Museum of Memory in Alta Vista, where they have collected stories, newspaper articles, artifacts over the last 50 years of all the conflict violence. And so they have all these artifacts, they have all these stories, and so what we've done is to help them, we're helping them right now repair and expand their facilities, but also they put all their resources online. So anyone in Colombia, anyone around the world can access them and search through them and see what exactly has happened. And so we've done these things without any kind of expectation that there's going to be any research in this community or anything else. We went in there with just simply the hope that, that this is a worthwhile peace-building project that we support, the city of Medellin supports, the university supports, and later on we may decide to do a study to look to see if these kinds of projects are helping reduce the level of violence, but we'll save that for later. And if it happens, that's wonderful. If it doesn't, it's still okay, because we feel like we've given back to Colombia because Colombia's given so much to us.
Please. Okay, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Parvati. Thank you for the very insightful lecture. I actually wanted to try and connect it with the workshop we had yesterday where we talked about reconciliation, and I wanted to see how there can be, so we looked at how conflict and the related violence can have an impact on endangered languages. I wanted to see if we can look at a reverse relationship. For instance, one of the concepts that we came across was something called the Sabbath Hypothesis, which says that the certain features of the language we speak, certain structural factors can affect the way we think, the way a society functions, our empathy, the way we interact, the social institutions we belong to. So can the features of these endangered languages be sort of used to heal a society that has just recovered from a conflict? For example, will learning each other's languages or certain projects that will help us see the world through the eyes of the people who've been on the other side of the violence for so long, will that help in reconciliation? In short, can we harness these endangered languages in order to speed up the process of reconciliation in the society?
I think so. I think, it's a good question. I think there are many ways in which that could happen. I think in places like Colombia, there first needs to, in many other countries around the world, there needs to be a recognition that these endangered languages need to be saved, and that there should be support and resources put into them. And I think that through the process of providing that kind of support, in Colombia, for example, just simply providing support for these communities, for their languages, for the teaching of their languages, helps them in many ways, because first of all, it illustrates that there is a government presence there. The government is trying to support them in some way. That in and of itself, the government presence will help discourage other groups from trying to move in there. I think it's also an interesting feature to look at with the endangered languages is to do the endangered languages and understanding the languages and trying to document them, to use the languages as a way to help us understand how those communities understand and process their experiences. How do they talk about the violence they underwent? How do they talk about reconciliation? Are there words and are there cultural practices that are prevalent in those communities that are very much about bringing people back together. So, for example, in Uganda, which has a number of different ethnic and linguistic groups there's some groups in the north that have certain practices that are about reconciliation, where people are going to spill wine or spill certain kinds of alcohol on the ground as a way to communicate that, we're returning these people to the community, to their homes, we're going to try to reconcile with them, and all is forgiven. So they have certain ceremonies that they go through that are unique to their culture in Uganda for reconciliation. So they use those old practices in this new context where these people are coming back into the communities after having perhaps even perpetrated violence on the community members. And I think in Colombia and other places around the world, I think the same thing applies. I think that through understanding these cultural practices, we understand how people reconcile in very many different ways that probably haven't even been discussed or touched upon in the kind of research that we were talking about yesterday. So I think there's a great deal that they can teach us about that. I don't know, Dr. King, would you want to say anything more?
So the one thing I would also say, because you were talking about the structures inside the language, and so I think that's why it's important to study countries where there's conflict and violence and you see this rich diversity of language so that you can compare them. One thing that can be difficult, if you look particularly at the Afro-Colombian areas, and that's why they're very interesting to study, is that it is inside the communities that the language is being maintained. And there can be pressures, particularly in the coastal areas, and where you may see the greater violence, where, say, for example, they're trying to bring in tourism, or you have that kind of economic inequality, to sort of go to the nearest best language, right, to form a kind of assimilation, because if you're going to be bringing in outsiders, you want them to be able to interact. They're not going to be able to interact with like 12 different kinds of language, right? And so it becomes incumbent upon the community to recognize that this can be part of the cultural language, and rather than just simply assimilating into the most common language, which is one thing you see in the urban areas, has clearly happened with Colombia, is to be able to recognize that that's part of the cultural heritage, and instead to emphasize multilingualism. And that's why linguists become so important, to be able to help figure out what are the commonalities across the language, so that as it is being taught, you can take those kinds of linguistic structures into consideration. Does that make sense? Right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kuryakos. I study history here. I'm very averse to quantitative data in general, so to start with that. I was very interested, I will start from where you have left at the end, because there are communities, especially in violent zones. I worked in Kashmir for my master's, so I've been noticing there are changes in language which is happening. A tongue which is spoken by the majority community, the Kashmiri community, is more or less becoming dead over years. Mm-hmm. One crucial player in it is the schooling system, which teaches either Urdu or an alternative, but not Kashmiri. There is also an action taken by communities themselves, either to give up language, as you've said, mm-hmm. to take up newer ones, or to reclaim the older languages, something which is happening in, let's say, Manipur. Meitei Mang script, it's not the language which they are reclaiming the script. Some of my friends who work on Bodo tribes would also say how Devanagari script have replaced the older Bengali script. Among tribes of Northeast, you have English alphabets replacing whatever was predominant to use their languages. So these reclaimings of languages can actually cause the death of language in one way, because your connection with the past or the archival sources which was informing your language can die out in this process. While I was listening to the presentation, as I said, I'm a bit averse to quant. I was wondering how quantifying this linguistic changes can bring in these complexities into the picture. That was one thing. How will you address this kind of complexities where sometimes communities change language, all of those, how are they going to? Second thing, I was Okay, no, I will leave it that there. The other one, okay.
It's very important. Can I start?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think you're raising a really important, and how is that, where is the assimilation being forced from? And we were speaking before about the role that the educational system can have on that. And I don't think there is a one size fits all. And that you have to, that's why it's so important that we look at how linguistic diversity is playing itself out across the different communities. Because we also think that it coincides with race and ethnicity as well, as you see as the difference between Afro-Colombian and indigenous populations over time. And so one of the things about Colombia's educational system is the concern is, to the extent that as you move to these outlying areas, they have these inferior educational systems, that in that kind of resource poor environment, I think we would argue that's the opportunity for language loss to occur, because government can come in and either force assimilation, or there will just be this kind of natural tendency to just give it up. Do you want to speak to the Gini index and sort of using an inequality? Or?
Yeah, although I'd say one kind of interesting feature of the Colombian conflict, where in some ways the most endangered languages in some ways may have an easier time surviving, is that, as I mentioned, the Colombian government has been notorious for just abandoning large parts of the country to violence, and with very little kind of presence in terms of education, police, social welfare systems, and so forth. And so the very remoteness of some of these communities has protected them to some extent from government efforts to sort of force Spanish or some kind of language assimilation. The communities that are more kind of risk are the ones that are kind of closer to the cities, where people do have access to the educational system, where they're going to be less likely to learn their language, and to all the other kind of issues that arise when you have these marginalized communities in close proximity to these cities, with the temptations and so forth, and all the other kinds of problems that may arise. In terms of the overall kind of what we try to do with our data is really like I said, begin at kind of like a very broad view. So we're kind of looking at this like you might using Google Earth. We have kind of this broad picture to try to understand how important is violence. We think it is, but once we get the data, are we going to find that yes, these relationships between violence and language loss, do they occur in all these different conflict zones across Colombia? Because again, it is still very diverse. And so when those relationships do occur, then we say, okay, then that is something worth further investigating. So it's almost kind of like demonstrating proof of concept. That yes, there's something to this relationship between language loss and violence. To really confirm it, we need to get into the community to understand the sequence of events. We can't talk about cause and effect unless we kind of know the sequence of events. So that's where we have to talk to the members of the community. We have to know something about their history. We have to also talk to the groups that were involved in the violence. The good news in Colombia is that people are generally quite willing to talk about a lot of this stuff. And so we can piece together these stories, but we're still kind of waiting to do this. It's still very difficult to get into many of these areas that we want to study in Colombia, precisely because of the violence. I was supposed to go to one of these areas back in January, but the State Department told me, no, I can't go there. So my own State Department, now the Colombians were fine, but my own State Department said, no, I can't go there. So that's one of the big issues right now, is preventing us from making these kind of qualitative efforts and telling people stories through history and narratives and so forth that will help us, give the complete story, not just a big level view of language loss.
And one last point on that is that I think then that would suggest what Dr. Meernik's saying is that as you go in and look, that's why your historical analysis will be so important. What is every community is going to be different. What's going to have been the role of government? Has it been an area that has been abandoned? Have conflict actors come in? What does the educational system do? Is there even any kind of formal educational system there? And examining whether formal educational systems do more harm than perhaps good when it comes to language loss. And so I've already made a personal note in my head to look at educational systems and thinking about that inside the communities where we're looking at the endangered where we're looking at language loss.
I have a question, but is there anyone for me? Oh, you want to leave? Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
There's one hand up in the back.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. My name is Abhishek. So I actually had two questions. One on the methodology that you employ. And you're careful to emphasize that what you're seeing is a correlation between language loss and political violence. So I'm wondering if you consider possible confounding effects that could happen, for example, due to terrain. It seems, at least from the slide that you showed, that terrain could be used to explain both the incidences of political violence and language loss. So I was wondering if you have studied such possible confounding effects. And the second is related to the loss of not just language but associated knowledge systems. I was wondering if you have encountered such things instead. Thank you.
I think not so much on the second question, but you're talking about sort of like reverse causality.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's certainly, there's a lot of that going on, because the very reason that these marginalized groups are attracted to these areas, the very reason that the conflict groups are attracted to these areas to begin with, like I said, there are many reasons. There may be military, there may be good places to grow coca, but generally, especially for like the rebel groups, these are marginal areas in which the government doesn't have a presence. Well, if you're a rebel group, that's a great place to start your conflict. If the government isn't there to begin with, and the only people that you have to contend with are members of these indigenous groups who are speaking these endangered languages, then them and their endangered languages don't really mean a whole lot to you, the rebel group. What you care about is the fact that the government isn't there. And so, yes, in that sense, most definitely, we think that there is this reverse causality where the very fact that these groups are living in these marginalized communities, and it's not just the indigenous groups with the endangered languages, it's also the Afro-Colombian groups that are targeted, because they're already in the areas where the government doesn't want to go. They've been kind of pushed there over time, and that's why the rebel groups like to start there, whether it's in the jungles or the mountains. Those are the places where they could set up shop, free from government interference, while they grow the size of their army. So there's definitely that relationship involved in it too. Good question. Kimi, do you want to add anything? Especially
Yeah,
about the
no,
second
I just
part,
think
the
that's why
knowledge?
it's so important. There's actually a debate in political science about whether you're targeted because you're a marginalized group and that's what causes your language to be lost, or whether or not you get targeted. You're just, they come after you because they know that you are a marginalized group and you're easier to pick on and you're in these areas. And so you have to kind of pull out all these threads.
Yeah, so I made a note about the slide where you're talking about armed actor presence and language endangerment, because there it shows
Do you want
that.
to go back to that?
Yeah,
Let's
if
go back to
I'm
that.
correct, then you
Yeah.
have not endangered language minority 65. Yeah, so where you don't have any active groups, so you have a lot of language endangerment there. So because I was then thinking that okay, there are many other socioeconomic factors which and that you talked about later on, communities is a big issue there. So and also I was thinking, even if there are no active groups, there must be various kinds of conflicts there, which actually result in these, having very poor socioeconomic conditions, and that as a result have this impact on the people speaking these languages. So I was just wondering about this, the difference here in the slide between the low numbers there. But of course, this is also, I think, statistically significant for you.
Yes.
But the difference was a bit striking. So so I was wondering as to what kind of conflicts do they have in these regions, even though there are no armed actors.
So what's happening in the 57%?
Yeah.
So much of that again is remote areas, especially out of the eastern part of Colombia, where it's very unpopulated, and to a lesser extent in the cities, there's just not nearly as much of a contestation year after year, and so the areas where the groups are fighting are been actually the areas where there's often been a lot of fighting in Colombia. It's these same areas. They kind of expand over time because
the drug cartels or the different paramilitary forces and the guerrilla groups discover new places to grow cocoa, or they discover new transportation routes, so the conflict moves in there, or they discover new remote regions where they can have a secure base without fear of government attack.
So does it really mean that these are peaceful areas as such? Just that means that.
Well, those are they're going to be more peaceful certainly than these areas. It doesn't mean there's no conflict violence. But the other thing that you wouldn't necessarily see, you mentioned there are other kinds of conflict, and I think probably the biggest kind of conflict would be economic conflict, because you do have a lot of multinational corporations that are very much interested in Colombia's oil wealth, gold, emeralds, the huge African palm plantations, banana plantations. There's a lot of the violence in Colombia that's about different groups acquiring land. Sometimes they claim it for political purposes, but oftentimes it kind of looks like they're just trying to enrich themselves. But even when the armed groups aren't doing that, if say, a large multinational wants to come into Putumayo, where you saw those pictures from earlier, because they discovered oil or some other kind of valuable mineral there. There may be no conflict groups there, the government may have a presence there, but there's still violence, because if someone in the community steps up and says, we don't want you digging for gold in this area, we don't want you exploring for oil here, then there's a pretty significant likelihood that people who kind of stick their heads out and complain about this will be threatened and often killed. The people who are most likely to be killed in Colombia are the environmental activists, in fact, right now. They have some of the highest percentages of environmental activist deaths in the world.
So it's a different kind of violence, and
Yeah.
that's why it's important to include homicides. That's exactly what it is. So an area may have been abandoned because it's no longer important. But you also see, like, for example, you even see it among, I just finished work looking at American Indians. So the way in the United States, we have the highest rates of violence, right? Because there's a lawlessness that is allowed to go on in some of these areas where people are. And so, you may think you've escaped the conflict violence only to find out that you have that violence that comes with poverty, the violence that comes with businesses that want to be able to control an area. And so what you're getting at is, I would suggest to everybody looking at this, we need to figure out really what's happening inside that 57%, because they are also important. Yeah. Really.
So I also made a note about some of the discussions here. But one minor point that I want to make is that we have seen in various parts, even in India, that language itself can be a source of conflict.
Yeah.
So ethnic violence, in fact, a lot of that we know about is language, cultural sometimes, and there again, so we have a lot of discussion here about education, etc. But I feel education. We have a topic of education itself can be actually what we're seeing very harmful for languages sometimes, mainly because of standardization efforts, and as a result we use a lot of dialects, we use varieties, we use language a lot because of organized education, because of various policies of government that we have to have these major national languages to be spread throughout the country and such things like that. So as a result, what linguists are doing a lot is revitalization. I think that is an important part, because the revitalized languages may or may not be considered part of the school curriculum, but if they are revitalized to a certain extent, that children can learn, read, and write in the language in whatever setup that is introduced by the people involved in those efforts, then that helps a lot in that process. And also, I think that whenever we have language as a source of conflict, there is the need for these kind of revitalization. It's not as if it's because they don't know that there's so much similarity between their languages. That ethnic violence, can be due to a lot of reasons. Sometimes that could be also revitalization could actually help, even if there is even if the source is
language or culture or some small differences between those languages. Because we have a very specific instance in Northeast India where this has happened in large scale violence because of two groups thought that one should be a standard language and not the other. And there was displacement as a result of that. So, those things have also happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. In Colombia, there was a change in their constitution in 1991 that gave a lot more rights and recognition to all these different ethnic groups. And by and large, the endangered language groups are relatively small, so they don't really kind of pose any sort of threat to some sort of notion of larger Colombian identity. And so the Colombian government has actually been fairly supportive of efforts to try to support these groups in many ways. I said not in every way, because they often abandon these areas. One thing they have done that's been very helpful, I think, is they've worked with my partner university, the Pontifical Bolivarian University, through what's called this ethno-education program. And what that does is that the teachers at the university provide instruction, university instruction to students who live in some of these remote areas. They go down to some of the cities that are close to where many of these endangered language groups live. They come in there and teach for a few months out of the year. And they're generally training the students in subject like education, social work, and the expectation and requirement in many cases is they go back into their communities, and then if they're teachers, they teach in the language, and also actually part of the project is for the students who graduate, what they have to do is, their project is something for, whether it's social work or education, the project that they have to complete in order to graduate is something that their community has voted on. They said, this is something we think is valuable, we agree with you, now go out and figure out how you're going to do this. And so it may be a project on developing a new kind of protein source in the area where they live, based upon kind of cultural traditions and things like that. So even though the Colombian government has neglected these communities in many ways, I think through some of these programs, they are certainly kind of supporting these groups and helping to kind of support their cultural heritage. It's still not enough, and these programs don't reach nearly as many of the endangered language community members as they need to. But I think at least because the size of these groups and the number of people speaking languages is so small, there isn't really any kind of threat to anybody's political interest. So that at least has kind of kept, I think, some of the armed groups from getting involved in issues about which language is taught in the schools. For the most part, that wasn't part of what they're fighting over.
But what you're getting at, if you could take it back to the initial slide on the pie of the most endangered, right? Yeah. So endangered extinction, that's really where there's the concern, and that's why as linguists, language documentation and conservation in conjunction with the kind of things that Dr. Meernik is talking about is really important, especially for those, and it really is kind of a race against time in some of these communities, because we already know that there are communities where it's already extinct essentially, and so there's still a small portion.
How many speakers would be there?
Oh,
yeah, some of them are ranging in, just double digits, maybe up to 100, some of them a few thousand.
but no, yeah, right. Yeah. That's why linguists matter.
Yeah, well, and part of the problem is that some of these, the number of speakers hasn't been measured in a while for some of these groups, because there's so many of them, and a lot of them are living in very remote areas. Some of the students that I met in Sibundoy, the place where the university taught its courses, they had to get there by boat, and it was about a 4-day journey. Some, 4 days by boat, and maybe a day or two trekking through the jungle. So it's not easy to reach these folks, and so we don't really often have a lot of good data on just how many speakers are left.
And another thing that's very important that we're thinking about is how to get educational supplies to them, because it's not only hard to reach, but they don't have the supplies for being able to teach or to do that kind of sharing. So complicated.
So, do you have more questions?
And we can continue this.
Yeah.
I mean, we really do see this. So I want all of you to be thinking about ways in which this might fit in with you, or people that you know that you are studying, or your own educational plans, what you want to go do, where you want to study, and the communities you want to be a part of. So we have cards.
Yes, can we see the cards again?
Yeah, we'll do the cards. We may have you take pictures because we're speaking tomorrow. We're running out of cards. But we really continue. Please feel free to email us or to reach out, and we'll be also talking with your faculty as well. No more. Come on, you must have questions. Comments.
Yeah. So I think we can conclude if there are no more questions. There's tea outside, and we can continue discussing things if you are curious. Meeting and Professor Castleberry, thank you so much for this engagement.
Thank you for the wonderful questions.
All right. Please step out right now.